Lindsey Graham loses his temper at Crockett. She hits back without raising her voice. The Senate chamber isn't supposed to feel like a boxing ring, yet on one unforgettable morning, it did. Every seat filled, every camera fixed, and every phone at the ready, waiting for a scrap that would make headlines before lunchtime. What began as a routine hearing about voting rights would become one of the most talked about political showdowns of the decade, fuel for every news cycle and viral meme from D.C. to Dallas. At its center, two figures who seemed destined to collide. Congresswoman Jasminecrockett, just 33 years old, a former public defender from Texas. Her navy blazer crisp, her confidence even crisper, she exuded the kind of unshakable calm that only comes from having stood toe-to-toe with power before and never backing down. Across the table sat Senator Lindsey Graham, battle-worn and red-faced, famous for his fiery words and his belief that seniority demands reverence. For years, Graham had played the Senate as his stage, wielding tradition and volume like shields against the oncoming tide of change. But this day was different. The air itself was tight with anticipation, everyone sensing that the pageantry of protocol was about to give way to something more primal. There's an old saying in politics, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. But what if someone brings logic to a shouting match? The audience would soon find out. Graham, already simmering, led the charge, his opening remarks loaded with accusations that sounded more like courtroom cross-examinations than legislative inquiry. You could almost see him positioning himself, eager to remind everyone who really runs the room. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She settled behind her microphone, eyes sharp, message clear. Respect isn't automatic, it's earned. What happened in the next few moments would prove this was more than just another partisan clash. It was a generational reckoning, a test of wills between the world that was and the one that's coming. News outlets would later call it a viral sensation, but for those in the room, it was more than content. It was electricity, blazing through every exchange, every raised voice, every carefully measured comeback. Crockett and Graham, more than opponents, became symbols. Tradition versus change, volume versus precision, the old guard's demand for obedience against a new leader's quiet refusal to flinch. But before the viral videos, before the trending hashtags and the political posturing, something deeper was at stake. This wasn't just about policy, it was about who owns the future of democracy, whose voice gets to shape the rules, and whether composure could triumph where outrage usually rules the day. So buckle up. The story you're about to hear isn't just a highlight reel, it's a turning point. The Senate, America, even the internet would never quite look the same. Already whispers were spreading. Did you see what Crockett just did? Can you believe Graham lost it like that? As the cameras zoomed and the world sat riveted, one confrontation became the spark that ignited a national debate on power. Who wields it, who challenges it, and what real strength in politics looks like in the 21st century. And this was only the beginning. If you looked beneath the surface, the showdown brewing in the Senate that day was years in the making. Lindsey Graham, senator, lightning rod, and defender of old-school decorum, wasn't just having a heated morning. The truth was, the ground beneath his feet had been shifting for some time. Once a favorite of his party's base, Graham now faced mounting criticism from all sides. His approval ratings in South Carolina had started to dip, with younger conservatives brushing him off as out of touch and on swirling about whether he was still the fighter they remembered. Rumors had built up all year. Was Graham losing his edge, desperate for a moment to prove he still commanded the stage? Across the table sat Jasminecrockett, embodying not just a new face, but a whole new playbook. Crockett's rise hadn't followed the rules. She was neither the polished career politician nor the careful compromiser. Before Congress, she waged battles in Texas courtrooms, standing up for those most likely to be overlooked. As a public defender and civil rights attorney in Dallas, she made a name not through speeches but through earned respect, defending the powerless, challenging broken systems, and calling out those who conflated tradition with justice. Her mantra was clear: respect is earned, not given according to rank or seniority. But personal backstories were only the start. The stakes that day were immense. A national debate over voting rights was headed for a flashpoint. Senator Graham would call it a matter of election integrity, warning against what he called federal overreach. For Congresswoman Crockett and her allies, it was a fight to protect democracy's most fundamental promise: that every eligible American gets their say. The legislation under discussion would determine voting access for millions, especially for people in communities of color, raising the temperature with every word exchanged. Yet there was something personal in the air, too, an invisible thread of tension that tethered the two adversaries together. This wasn't their first run-in. Months earlier, in a House Judiciary hearing, Crockett had cornered a witness Graham endorsed, dismantling his narrative and fueling weeks of commentary about gotcha politics. Since then, Graham's offhand remarks about young Democrats who don't understand the way things work were clearly aimed in her direction, even if he never said her name. Political insiders and reporters whispered that this meeting was inevitable. H had spent weeks preparing, the veteran lawmaker rehearsing his offensive, the young congresswoman quietly dissecting his tactics, ready to bring Texas tenacity to the most hallowed hall in America. Crockett didn't want just another debate. She wanted a reckoning. She told her team, "If Senator Graham wants to feel the heat, I'll show him how Texas does it." So the stage was set, not just for a policy dispute, but for a generational battle. Old guard versus new blood, seniority versus the merit of ideas, the traditional power dynamic on trial. The entire nation held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when those two worlds crashed together, knowing instinctively that win or lose, the rules of political engagement were about to change before their eyes. And the tension in that chamber, it was just the first sign of the storm to come. The spark that set the entire Senate chamber ablaze started with a single, tightly wound question. Senator Graham, papers clenched, voice trembling with the tension of years on the offensive, fired the first real shot. "Miss Crockett," he called out, letting the title drip with condescension, "you Democrats think you can waltz in here and lecture us about democracy while you're trying to destroy it." The claim was bold, sharp, and instantly viral. Flashbulbs fired as reporters stopped pretending to take neutral notes, their attention drawn like moths to a flame. Crockett met his accusation head-on with a composure that only made her more dangerous. She didn't flinch, twist, or look away. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile you see moments before thunder breaks a summer sky. She calmly adjusted her microphone, then stared directly into Graham's eyes, refusing to yield even an inch. It was a look honed from years spent defending the powerless against louder, older men who underestimated her at their own peril. But Graham wasn't backing down either. Each of her measured words only seemed to make him angrier, as if the idea that someone so much younger, someone he found so easy to dismiss, would not shrink from his authority was a personal affront. When Crockett invoked the Constitution, he cut her off mid-sentence. "Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young lady. I was studying constitutional law when you were in elementary school." The room stirred, the temperature rising with every syllable, as Crockett remained unruffled, letting the slight bounce off her as if prepped for this very moment. What happened next shattered any illusion that this was a tame policy debate. Graham rose from his chair, a move calculated to intimidate, to use his height and presence as weapons. "These election laws you want to overturn were passed by democratically elected state legislatures. Democracy only counts when it goes your way, right?" The line was meant to land like a punch, but Crockett waited, head held high, letting the moment hang just long enough for Graham to realize his outburst hadn't shaken her. If anything, it had played right into her hands. The argument escalated. Graham's voice grew louder, his words veering further from reason and more into personal territory. "All you care about is playing the victim, coming here with your accusations of voter suppression. What you really want is to make it easier to cheat." The accusation echoed through the chamber, the cameras zooming in. Crockett stayed silent, her expression a study in controlled intensity. And then, in a move that would soon echo across social media and news channels, Crockett leaned in. Calm but unyielding, she delivered the line that flipped the narrative entirely. "Are you accusing me personally of wanting to facilitate election fraud?" The silence that followed was absolute, a high-wire act where the crowd hung suspended, waiting for Graham's answer. By the time Graham realized he'd been cornered by his own words, it was too late. The spark had found tinder. As the last syllable fell, the balance of power in the room had shifted, and a showdown years in the making exploded into the national spotlight. This wasn't just a political debate. It was the moment everyone would remember, replay, and dissect for years to come. The moment Graham's finger landed, pointing, trembling with frustration, the entire chamber seemed to crystallize. You could have heard a pin drop. He thundered about disrespect, about young politicians who cared more about going viral than about understanding tradition, his voice echoing around the marble halls. Sweat prickled on his forehead. Cameras captured every staccato gesture. Yet while Graham lost himself in anger, Jasmine Crockett was the living contradiction to every accusation hurled her way. She didn't raise her voice or match his volume. Instead, Crockett answered with an unshakable, lawyerly calm, hands folded on the table like she was back in a Texas courtroom, watching the prosecution unravel. As Graham ranted, her posture remained perfect, her breathing steady. Her only movement was a slight tilt of her head, as if assessing the strength of an argument she'd already decided would collapse. When there was finally a break in Graham's tirade, Crockett leaned forward, voice still serene. "Are you finished, Senator?" The words, softly spoken, cut deeper than any raised voice could. For a moment, Graham was left speechless. A man so used to holding the floor, suddenly unsure if he should speak. The power dynamic was altered with one simple question. As Graham nodded, still catching his breath, Crockett's next words carried the floor. "Good, because now it's my turn." She collected her thoughts, refusing to rush, and looked him straight in the eye. A signet. To everyone watching that she would not be intimidated, not by politics, not by age, not by volume. Crockett's calm was her armor. She began. "You mentioned I'm young. You're right. I am. But I haven't raised my voice once today. Meanwhile, the record clearly shows where the volume is." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the room, the crowd recognizing the shift. By refusing to match his tone, Crockett exposed the performance for what it was, a spectacle of bluster over substance. She pressed on, issuing a brief clinical rundown of her credentials as a public defender, her years battling for those pushed aside by louder, more powerful adversaries. "I learned early on, when someone chooses shouting over answers, it's often because they have none." The point was made not as an insult, but as a lesson, as if she were reminding everyone why facts will always outlast fury. And Crockett came with facts, not feelings. She calmly rattled off statistics about voting patterns and laws, cited constitutional amendments, and then asked the question none of Graham's shouting could answer. "With all your years of experience, can you name one law you've supported that made it easier for eligible Americans to vote?" Silence. While Graham fumbled, checked his notes, then looked away, it was clear the room now belonged to Crockett. She closed her rebuttal with composure undented. "Respect isn't earned through age or aggression, Senator. It's earned by showing up prepared and treating people with dignity, no matter their age, background, or party." The audience and the entire nation watching online didn't just see a viral moment. They saw a roadmap for a new kind of political power, facts as foundation, composure as courage, and true strength defined by grace under pressure. The dam finally broke with a phrase so simple it rang through the country like a clarion bell. "Are you finished, Senator?" In a single moment, Jasmine Crockett seized control, not just of the Senate chamber but of the entire national conversation. While Graham's voice faded, Crockett's calm, almost surgical delivery became instantly iconic. Even before she spoke her next line, you could sense the power shift. What was previously a one-sided barrage became a measured, strategic dismantling, so precise that it would be replayed in viral loops across every major platform. Now it was Crockett's turn at the microphone, and she knew how to use silence as a weapon. She took a sip of water, adjusted her blazer, and faced Graham with a look that spoke volumes. The entire committee room, from veteran senators to congressional staffers, felt it. Composure beats chaos every time. Crockett wasn't there to be anybody's emotional foil. She was there to set the record straight. Her opening gambit was a soft but unmistakable flex. "You say I'm young and loud, Senator, but check the footage. One of us hasn't raised their voice once all day." The crowd buzzed, some stifling laughter, others arching eyebrows. Social media would soon explode over the contrast, creating instant memes pairing Graham's gestures with Crockett's serene expression. But Crockett wasn't about to let the viral moment rest on mere optics. She reached for her folder and began laying out facts with clinical precision. Step by step, she cited the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, and how Graham's own state record reflected barriers for voters of color. She rattled off the numbers: counties with high black populations facing longer lines, more restrictive ID requirements, polling locations shuttered. Each fact, calmly delivered, was a body blow far more effective than any insult. When Graham tried to interrupt, she simply held up a finger and continued, controlling the tempo with ease. "Senator, you had your time. Now, let's talk about data, not drama." It was a rhetorical clinic, her experience as a public defender on full display. Crockett cited conservative sources for voter fraud statistics, exposing the gap between the supposed problem and the reality. 31 cases out of more than 59 million votes, Senator. That's not a crisis. That's a rounding error. The chamber was silent, the nation transfixed. Even Graham, used to cowing opponents, could only shuffle his papers, unable to find a substantive retort. Crockett pressed, "Can you name one time you've backed a policy that made voting easier, not harder, for eligible Americans?" The silence answered for him. Cameras caught the flicker of discomfort on his face, an image destined to headline political Instagram feeds for weeks. The tidal wave reached beyond that room. Instantly, commentators on both sides weighed in. Tweets with the hashtag #CrockettClapback became the hottest trend. TikTok split-screen videos paired Graham's outburst with Crockett's calm for millions to see. Even seasoned news anchors called it a masterclass in composure. In a matter of minutes, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She set a new viral standard for how political power is wielded, not through shouting, but through facts, poise, and a perfectly timed question that let the whole world know who truly owned the moment. As Jasmine Crockett's final words echoed across the marble chamber, the reaction outside those hallowed walls flared into a digital wildfire. Before the committee chairman could even call for a recess, the internet had already declared a winner. Twitter erupted. The #CrockettClapback was trending worldwide within minutes, boosted by millions who instantly recognized a moment of political mastery when they saw it. Clips of the exchange hit TikTok and Instagram Reels with dizzying speed. Dozens of creators remixed the showdown. Graham's angry outburst, set to over-the-top rock music, instantly juxtaposed with Crockett's level, piercing question over calm classical. One viral video layered her phrase, "Are you finished, Senator?" with a slow-motion zoom on Graham's stunned face, the caption simply asking, "Is this the moment the old guard fell?" Political junkies and average viewers alike couldn't get enough. A single tweet, "Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in how to handle a bully. This is what real strength looks like," garnered over 47,000 retweets by the end of the hour. Instagram feeds filled up with stills. Graham's finger, Crockett's folded hands, the visible shift in control. Every frame reinforced what so many had craved, a public official who kept her cool when the heat was at its highest. The explosion spanned every partisan divide. On Fox News, even regular commentators were forced to acknowledge Crockett's composure, if not her politics. She outmaneuvered him completely. "When you're reduced to yelling while your opponent recites the Constitution, you've already lost," one primetime host admitted. Meanwhile, Democrats and independents cheered her as a rising star, a fresh voice who wasn't afraid to press facts over fury. House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries lauded her immediately. "Strong, smart, unflappable, that's the leadership we need." Conservatives tried to regroup, some praising Graham's intent while quietly lamenting his tactics. Senator Ted Cruz insisted the moment was simply passion about election integrity. But his comment thread quickly filled with memes and side-by-side gifs. Graham's red-faced shouting on one end, Crockett's quiet smile on the other. Even behind closed doors, anonymous Republican aides confessed to reporters, "She ate his lunch. He looked like the angry old man. She looked like the adult in the room." Major news networks didn't waste a second dissecting the spectacle. Anderson Cooper spent an entire segment on the exchange, bringing in body language experts and political consultants. "What we saw was a new standard," he observed. "Strength measured not by the loudest voice, but by the calmest resolve." An expert broke down the visuals. Crockett's steady eyes, her refusal to fidget or interrupt, contrasted with Graham's pacing, jabbing finger, and breaking voice. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow opened her show with praise for Crockett's incident-by-incident prep and her choice to answer bluster with constitutional fact. On every platform, the verdict was the same. Crockett's viral moment wasn't just about delivering a perfect comeback. It signaled a changing tide in American discourse. Real authority, it seemed, now rested with those who could keep their cool, marshal data and wield silence as powerfully as words. And as millions shared, commented, and debated late into the night, one thing was crystal clear. Washington would never be able to put this genie back in the bottle. In the hours and days after Jasmine Crockett's poised rebuttal, the effects were felt far beyond the bright lights of the Senate committee room. Lindsey Graham, rattled and visibly uncomfortable, hurried out of the chamber, papers clutched and head down, avoiding the crush of reporters eager for a reaction. Crockett, meanwhile, accepted congratulations from colleagues with her trademark composure, a picture of calm in the storm she'd just weathered. Yet the real tidal wave hit across America's political landscape and in the media echo chambers. Political strategists, campaign consultants, and party operatives pored over the footage. Democratic leadership wasted no time spotlighting Crockett as a symbol of the new generation, a leader unafraid to challenge the old guard with facts and patience rather than noise. Party fundraising emails quoted her, calling out the importance of strength through grace, not aggression. Up-and-coming politicians took notes and, in private, admitted they'd just seen a lesson in how to flip a power dynamic with dignity. On the Republican side, fallout was more complicated. Graham's staff scrambled to recover, blaming media bias or gotcha clips for the senator's on-camera struggles. Some tried to spin the incident as a passionate defensive process, but there was no hiding the discomfort behind closed doors. Anonymous sources whispered to journalists that Graham had simply lost control. And in politics, those optics can haunt a career longer than any election result. Even political rivals conceded the image of Crockett calmly dissecting Graham's arguments would stick in voters' minds. Cable news churned out segment after segment. CNN analysts replayed the takedown with freeze frames, body language breakdowns, and expert panels weighing in on what Crockett's rising star meant for generational change. MSNBC cast the moment as a triumph for women and young leaders, proof that old-school intimidation was losing its hold on the national stage. Fox News, caught in a corner, pivoted to dissecting the policy but couldn't help but concede Crockett's media savvy. When your opponent leaves the hearing room with all eyes on her and you're trending for all the wrong reasons, it's time to rethink your strategy, commented one conservative columnist. But the influence didn't stop at news desks or party headquarters. For millions who watched, replayed, and debated the clip, a new template for public leadership emerged. Clear, composed, unbothered by personal drama. High school debate coaches played the clip for students. Law professors wrote think pieces on the courtroom-like control Crockett showcased. Late-night comedians found endless material, but most jokes landed on the old ways, not the new. Even Crockett's critics had to acknowledge the seismic impact. Across party lines, there was a grudging respect for the way she transformed perceived weakness, youth, newness, composure, into undeniable strength. With each replay, the consensus grew. This wasn't just a single viral moment. It was a shift in how authority, argument, and even anger are wielded on America's biggest stages. And as the news cycle moved on, the lesson lingered. One measured response had changed the game. The future, it seemed, now belonged to those who could harness facts, stand steady in the storm, and turn even the wildest outbursts into opportunities to lead. In the aftermath of that viral Senate showdown, something undeniable was left behind, a lesson about power, progress, and what it really means to lead when the world is watching. The memes and sound bites eventually faded, but the questions Crockett and Graham raised still echoed across social feeds, classrooms, and kitchen tables alike. The moment reached far beyond the walls of Congress. It wasn't simply about who had the last word in a committee hearing. It was about the deeper shift playing out across the landscape of American politics. A shift from noise to nuance, from authority demanded to authority earned. For years, the only strength that got airtime was the kind that shouted, interrupted, tried to win by sheer volume. But in those few minutes, Crockett proved there's another way. Let your opponent rant, hold your ground, and win the room with composure and command of the facts. What made Crockett's moment so powerful wasn't just her skill in debate or the statistics she brought to bear. It was her restraint. She refused to play by the old rules. No shouting, no personal attacks, no descent into chaos. Against a backdrop of growing frustration with the typical brawls of cable news and campaign ads, her approach felt not only novel, but necessary. She exposed the cracks in the old playbook, showing the next generation that sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the quiet one, armed with principles and patience. The lasting impact was instantly visible and yet quietly profound. Young politicians and activists found inspiration, not just in Crockett's victory, but in her method. In offices and classrooms, teachers and mentors played back the footage as an example of how to argue without losing your cool or your dignity. For voters weary of spectacle, Crockett's style was more than a breath of fresh air. It was proof that politics can still reward substance, that facts and composure are not relics but blueprints for something better. Even those who disagreed with Crockett's politics couldn't ignore the moment's force. Quietly, even reluctantly, some admitted their respect. That's the mark of real impact, when you shift the ground enough for opponents to reconsider what respect, leadership, and debate actually mean. And at the core, the questions lingered. Questions bigger than documents or party lines. Who decides the tone of America's future? Will old guard tactics, intimidation, aggression, tradition for its own sake continue to dominate? Or will the new guard's calm, clarity, and reliance on principle win the day? For millions watching, the answer felt closer than ever before. Because what happened in that chamber wasn't just the toppling of one political confrontation. It was the demonstration that lasting change comes not from the loudest voices, but from the most steadfast. Crockett's example set a new bar for leadership, for advocacy, for discourse itself. So the next time a would-be power broker tries to dominate the dialogue with yelling and finger-pointing, there will be a blueprint already burned into public memory. Stay calm, stay grounded, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. The real impact? A signal to the country that respect, once thought lost in the noise, might just be ready to make a comeback.